Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Ajeng Larasati from Harm Reduction International, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's launch of Aiding Executions, How Aid Donors and the United Nations Enable the Death Penalty for Drug Offenses. On behalf of Harm Reduction International and the Institute for Journalism and Social Change, we thank you all for joining us today. Before we begin, I would like to share a few housekeeping announcements. First, please note that this webinar is being recorded and the recording may be made available after the event. Second, the simultaneous interpretation into Bahasa Indonesia is available. If you would like to listen in Bahasa Indonesia, please click the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select Bahasa Indonesia. If you are joining on a mobile device, you can access interpretation through I think it's More menu. Throughout today's event, we encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A function. We will collect questions throughout the discussion and address as many as possible during the Q&A session toward the end of the webinar. Now, a few words about today's event. Today we are launching a new report by the Institute for Journalism and Social Change and Harm Reduction International entitled Aiding Executions, How Aid Donors and the UN Enable the Death Penalty for Drug Offenses. The report explores a largely overlooked issue, how international aid intended to support development and drug control programs can, in some cases, contribute to systems that retain and impose the death penalty for drug-related offenses. By tracing aid flows from donor governments and the UN to narcotic control programs, the report raises important questions about accountability, transparency, and compliance with international human rights standards. This conversation comes at a particularly important moment. While the use of the death penalty for drug offenses has increased significantly in recent years, funding for evidence-based health, harm reduction, and social interventions continues to decline. Before we begin the discussion, let me briefly outline today's program. I see there's a echo. So if you can turn your audio off, that would be good. We will start with a presentation of the report's key findings by Claire Provost, the report's lead author. This will be followed by a roundtable discussion with our distinguished panelists who will reflect on the report from their perspective areas of expertise. We will then open the floor for questions from the audience before concluding with concluding remarks from our beloved Executive Director, Catherine Cook. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Claire Provost, co-founder and co-director of the Institute for Journalism and Social Change and lead author of the report. She is formerly head of the global investigation at Open Democracy and a data journalist at Guardian. She has led award-winning investigations into power, finance, democracy, and human rights. Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who's joined today. Let's see. Yes, okay, I see my slides coming up. Thank you. So I'm going to give a brief presentation before handing over to the other terrific speakers that we have assembled today, and then for hopefully some opportunity to discuss with everyone who's joined. And again, thank you for joining from wherever you are. This report that we're launching today, Aiding Executions, How Aid Donors and the UN Enable the Death Penalty for Drug Offenses, is the product of a cross-border and cross-disciplinary collaboration involving the Institute for Journalism and Social Change and investigative journalists and researchers and writers that we brought together to work on this project, as well as activists in the harm reduction space and drug policy space. So from the beginning, it was very much a collaboration across borders and across disciplines. At the same time, it also, and I wanted to be able to mention this up front so I could welcome some people I see who are on the call. In particular, this project also embedded a learn while doing approach from the beginning, and so involved intentional opportunities to share skills on how to do follow the money research, for example, on data journalism, on connecting the dots between different disciplines. And so as part of this project, we also had the opportunity to involve master's students at in global data journalism classes at SOAS, the University of London, through a partnership with Institute for Journalism and Social Change. And I see some of our students on the call today, so thank you very much for joining. And so if we go to the next slide, thank you very much. So this report has a focus on aid funding for the infrastructure for the death penalty and executions around the world. These are not the only international funding flows that will be supporting the infrastructure for executions and death penalty cases. However, they're very significant flows that are coming from budgets that have very specific purposes to support global development goals, help end poverty, support health and education, and also, very importantly, do no harm in the process. So these are very particular funding flows as part of the expected mix of international finance supporting the infrastructure for executions and the death penalty. So up front, I want to say this is everything we'll share today will very much be the tip of the iceberg in terms of international financing, but also even in terms of aid funding. And that is also related to, for example, limitations and transparency gaps that I'll discuss in a minute. So everything we'll share is, I think, should be interpreted as the tip of the iceberg, but it's a very particular controversial tip of the iceberg because of where exactly this money is coming from. Any aid money that supports the war on drugs is counterproductive, deeply questionable, should probably end. Any aid for the war on drugs in countries where there's the death penalty, where we have such high stakes, it's really horrific and needs particularly immediate attention and action. Particularly in this context at this moment, and so also mention the context up front, which can otherwise seem like the elephant in the room, is we're at a moment when aid is under increasing pressure. This is not an anti-aid report. The conclusions are not anti-aid. They're about making sure that every dollar is spent well, effectively. So it's very much in favor of the aid effectiveness agenda. I also see some people on the call from that space. So thank you for joining. At this moment, it's more important than ever that every dollar is used well. And by identifying and challenging and redirecting funding that is not being used well, you can do two good things with every dollar. So this report is a follow the money report, but with an impact focus and findings that really should spur discussion and change. This report in particular, we focused on international aid funding and funding that was going in particular through an official sector code called narcotics control, has this code 16063. So this is an officially sanctioned category of international aid spending. It has an official definition that is on the screen. This definition is set, this spending is monitored by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And this report uses the OECD's data set. So and it uses ultimately figures that have been and data that come from the aid donors themselves. So the aid donors themselves have reported these figures to the OECD. In some cases, they've also published them to the International Aid Transparency Initiative, but certainly not in all cases. And in the case of the OECD has accepted them as eligible aid spending records. So go on to that's about the sources and where the figures come from. This is the OECD in Paris. It's the image on the left is of its headquarters in this extraordinary historic building in Paris. And on the right hand, we see the list of the members of the OECD's Development Assistance Committee. So they include a number of individual states as well as the European Union overall. And so these are the states that sit on the Development Assistance Committee. The Development Assistance Committee is the part of the OECD that determines whether spending is eligible to be counted as official development assistance, which is the formal term for aid. The OECD DAC, to use the acronyms, is also the institution that publishes the statistics that we used in this report. They manage and oversee the definitions. Not all of these countries that we see on the right-hand side have declared themselves to be spending aid on narcotics control activities in countries where there's the death penalty, but all of them sit on the committee that ultimately oversees the eligibility and the statistics in this area. So if you have any connections to any of those countries, there's a connection between you and this report. Also, if you have any connections to any of the countries that we see on this screen, then you have a connection to, sorry, the next one is the map. This map shows the top recipients of the funding that we followed. And so if you have any connections to any of those countries, you also have a connection to this report. Overall, we counted about $60 million over the last decade spent on narcotics control in countries retaining the death penalty. Over this decade, there's spending every year, but it did seem to drop between the years of 2017 and 2020 before increasing quite significantly in these countries. Um, so this reflects a decade-long problem, but a problem that is not organically going down. So a problem that needs some more concerted information, investigation, action. Let's go to the next slide. Uh, this is on the left-hand side, we see, and these charts all come from the report, so you can see them more in the report as well. This chart on the left-hand side was produced by one of our master's students in one of our data journalism classes with SOAS, Chiara, who I believe is on the call as well today. And it shows in particular the funding flows from donors to countries that not only retain the death penalty for drug-related offenses, but that regularly use it. So high application states, which in particular, Iran, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam. When you focus on these countries in the data set, Japan emerges as the top donor. Overall, the US is generally the top donor when you do aid analyses because it has been such a disproportionately large donor. So it's quite significant that when you focus on this very critical subset, actually the top donor is Japan. And so there are particular questions for the Japanese on this. On the right-hand side, there's just some examples of the kinds of projects that appear underneath these funding flows. So underneath the category of narcotics control, official development assistance, these are some of the examples of what we found in the project level data. So I'm going to read some of them out because they're really not what you would expect to see in project level records for international development spending. For example, enhanced Iranian law enforcement capacities on border management, drugs, precursors controls, interdiction, and seizures, strengthening the capacity of drug control institutions in Bangladesh, aid to provide drug control equipment. So sometimes, as in the first example, you have you have activities referenced in the project record, but also objectives. So the activities being capacity development of the police in Iran, and then the objectives being, get better at drug control, interdiction, seizures. So this is not what I've looked at international aid spending for a very long time, and this is not what I would be expecting to see in project records. It's very jarring to see these such details next to the records of other projects that have objectives to get more girls into school, for example, and you see something like that in the project record instead. So let's go on to the next slide. I think I'm uh, sort of nearing the end. So just to mention some key transparency gaps and limitations. So related to all of what I mentioned at the beginning about all of this being the very controversial tip of the iceberg, there are some key transparency gaps and limitations in the analysis that we were able to do. This screen shows an example of a project funded by Canada going through the UNODC, the UN Office for Drugs and Crime. But it is not under narcotics control. It is under a sector called Public Sector Policy and Administrative Management. It's an ongoing project going until March 2027. And it shows how there are also projects that are supporting the war on drugs in countries with the death penalty for drug-related offenses that might not be categorized as narcotics control. They could be categorized in a different sector. So this points to two things. One, the sector code is not the only problem here. The fact that that there is a war on drugs, narcotics control sector code, it is a problem, but it's not the only problem here, and money could shift to other sectors. Um, it also suggests that there is probably significantly more funding of relevance from aid budgets than what we have found in our report and documented in our report focused on this one particular sector code. This project was findable through the International Aid Transparency Initiative because the donor or the implementer in this case did publish, no, it would have been the donor that did publish to IADI. But there are so many other ongoing projects that would be going on right now that we can't see because there's significant lack of publishing to the International Aid Transparency Initiative by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC in particular, but also maybe some other donors spending money in this area. So the International Aid Transparency Initiative, it is at its when it works at its best, it is a phenomenal, detailed resource enabling transparency and accountability of not just previous aid spending, but also current and budgeted aid spending, not just the first level of what's declared, but also down a possible chain of implementing organizations. At its best, and when it works at its best, that's what it can do. It definitely does not do that in this case, and we were not able to rely on it for the analysis overall. We did find some significant projects looking at IADI data, but again, they sort of more point to transparency gaps and what we should be able to see, but we can only see on a very, very partial level. Okay, next slide. In the report, you'll also find case studies that were contributed by reporters in different countries. So there's one focused on a recipient country, Iran, one focused on a bilateral donor, Japan, and then one focused on a major multilateral organization in this space, UNODC. And again, we see a chart here contributed by another one of our master's students that shows how when you focus on Japanese aid, Iran in particular comes up as the top recipient. And Iran, I think as many of you know on the call today, is a leading executor of people for drug-related offenses. In the decade examined, it's thousands of executions. So it's an extremely, extremely pressing case study. Okay, thank you, Ajeng. Next slide. And um, uh, uh, So in the Iran case study, we have examples, which you can look at in the report. We have examples both of concrete funding, purchasing, for example, drug detection and devices, as well as some of some examples of the really significant human cost of the war on drugs in Iran. That is that is extremely controversial for any aid spending to be touching at all. Next slide. Um, from the UNODC case study, we also saw very directly, in very, I think I put it on the slide because I thought it was very alarming. This example of the head of the UNODC office in Indonesia commending the Indonesian National Drug Agency for a quote unquote successful operation, seeming to claim credit and also having supported the drug agency leading up to a significant raid in which several people were arrested, faced death penalty charges. One of those was a 24-year-old who described being only on a recently joined crew member, had no rights, no authority, no courage, no experience to assess the situation at the time. Again, very significant human consequences, very, very close to international institutions that should be supporting human rights, should not be enabling international public funding to be supporting the infrastructure for death penalty cases, charges, threats, etc. Well, next slide, and I think this is my concluding slide. So please look at the report for more detail. And I'm very excited to hear from the next speakers. I think the objective is clear here that international aid should not be it should be saving lives, not helping to take them. Narcotics control should not be an eligible category of aid spending anywhere, but really, especially in countries retaining the death penalty, it should be removed, immediately investigated these from with very serious consequences, how this money has been spent and what kind of reparative action must be taken to start addressing the harms of this spending.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you so much, Claire, for that excellent presentation and for taking us through the report's key findings. I'm sure these findings have given us all like much to reflect on and will spark an important conversation about the implication of international aid, human rights, and drug policy. With that, let's turn to our distinguished panelists. We have three panelists for today's roundtable. First is Professor Mai Sato, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran and Director of Institute for Crime and Justice Policy Research at Birkbeck University of London. Second panelist is Jada Girelli, Senior Analyst at Harm Reduction International, whose work focuses on the intersection of drug policy and human rights. And the third panelist is Yenti Nur Hidayat, the Executive Director of Puskaha Indonesia, a leading organization working on legal reform and budget governance. Thank you all for joining us today, dear panelists. For this discussion, I will pose three questions to you. We'll go one by one, and I will invite each of you to respond to these questions. And to ensure everyone has opportunity to contribute and that we leave enough time for audience questions, I will kindly ask everyone to keep their response to around 3 to 4 minutes. Let's begin. So the first question is, what was the most concerning findings in the report for you, and why is it important to have this discussion now? Maybe we can start with Professor Mai Sato, followed by Jada, and then by Yanti.
Thank you so much, Jen. But maybe first, thank you, and thank you for having me on the panel, and also many congratulations for the publication of this report. So I was very pleased to play a very small part to the report, and I was very excited for it to be published. And thank you again for having me on the panel. So, Jen, going back to your question about the most concerning finding and then why now? So I'm here wearing basically two hats. One is the UN Special Rapporteur on Iran, so I'd like to make some comments about Iran's drug policy and executions. But I'm also a member of Crime Info, which is an NGO in Japan, so I'd like to make some comments about the role of Japan and about advocacy as well. But in terms of the concerning findings, I'll start with Iran. Um, I think Iran is, of course, known to be one of the world's sort of leading executioner. And last year, in 2025, the total number of executions, I reported a conservative figure of 1,600. Around half of those executions are for drug-related offences. So the drug-related offences executions are current and ongoing. It continued during the nationwide protests, and drug-related executions also continued during the war as well. But the number of drug-related executions in Iran has very much fluctuated. Back in 2017, 2018, there was a reform of the Iran drug narcotics law, and I'm more than happy to go into more details if anyone would like to know. But it basically drastically reduced the number of drug-related executions. I believe 2018, the known executions for drugs was something like 23, 26. And then over the last sort of 5, 6 years or so, the number has increased and it's in the 800s in 2025. And in terms of, why now, why is the publication of the report now so important? I think it's important because there may be a possibility for reform inside the country. Last year, there was already the same narcotics law, another amendment that was tabled. And of course, I think that's put on hold because of the 12-day military escalation, followed by nationwide protest and war. But the bill is still there. So there is still sort of possibility. So I thought that was significant, but also concerning. In terms of Japan, I think it's concerning because Japan is a retentionist state, but it's a very low executing state. The execution figures are often zero or in the single digits. And Japan doesn't execute for drug-related offenses. So combining those, it's concerning that retentionist country, but with a very low executing figures who executes only for murder, is providing aid to another country, in this case Iran, and that is complicit in the so-called drug executions abroad. And I think in terms of why now, I think reading the report, Japan's largest disbursement to Iran's narcotics program, I think, was in 2022, and with equipment handovers continue in 2025. So that this is a very current, ongoing support, I think also gives very much a weight to this report. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Gerda, do you mind coming next for your answer?
Sure. Thanks, Ajeng. I hope you can hear me. And good morning, good afternoon to everybody who joined us today. So I guess I'll echo a lot of the conclusions that Claire highlighted in her presentation. But I guess to us, the most concerning finding was certainly the amount of funding and support flowing from countries which don't even use the death penalty as a tool of drug control into drug law enforcement in retention states, the fact that these flows exist in the first place, and also how UN agencies and other international actors who should monitor against human rights abuses appear to have ended up either acquiescing or accepting the risk of enabling such human rights abuses, sometimes against their own standards and policies. Coupled with it, I think particularly concerning was the lack of transparency, which Claire was hinting at the end of her presentation. We're talking here about public funds and public institutions, yet reconstructing these flows and these projects and what's actually supported in practice is extremely hard. There are sometimes insurmountable barriers that I'm sure Claire can speak more about. What's even harder to fully reconstruct is whether there's any human rights due diligence process in place, which policies should be followed to assess, monitor, and evaluate these processes, and whether this due diligence has actually happened and how. There's again, much that we don't know. The report, for example, talks about over $300 million that were spent for narcotics control in developing countries in the past decade, which we have no information on. So we know that the money went to to the so-called developing countries, but we don't know where it went exactly and to do what. Again, the kind of human rights and do no harm assessments carried out by both donor countries, but also intermediaries such as UNODC and UNOPS also remain in many cases unclear simply because nothing is made publicly available. And this lack of transparency is not just a methodological issue, it's really a key finding. It points to a key gap. And I'm really happy to see people from the transparency movement on the call. I hope we can have a follow-up conversation on this. Now, why is it important to have this discussion now? Because we're facing a sort of perfect storm. On one side, we have drug-related executions globally, which are reaching record high levels. In 2025, HRI reported over 1,200 executions for drug control over the world. This is a conservative figure based on civil society monitoring, and it's the highest figure HRI reported since it started monitoring this phenomenon back in 2007. Drug-related executions are also responsible for almost half of all executions that we see around the world. And so we can safely say that punitive drug control drives use of the death penalty globally, despite no evidence that this measure does really anything to deter drug trafficking, drug manufacturing, and despite clear international standards against use of the death penalty as a tool of drug control. At the same time, on the other side, we're facing an unprecedented crisis of funding for health and social services, which are proven to save lives and to make communities safer. We know of the funding cuts to harm reduction and HIV prevention and treatment back in 2025, but these were just the last of a long-standing decrease in international funding for these services. These are exactly the interventions that official development assistance is supposed to support and enable, yet essential services are shutting down, community-led organizations are left with shoestring budgets, while these funds continue supporting the infrastructure, which risks enabling death sentences and executions and other human rights violations in the name of drug control. And so if there was a perfect moment to have a conversation about where limited money goes, this is the moment.
Thank you, Jada. But Yanti, do you wanna come next, please?
Ya, halo.
Great.
Terima kasih Mbak Ajeng. Kawan-kawan, izinkan saya menggunakan bahasa Indonesia karena mesin penerjemah di kepala saya bekerja sangat lambat. Jadi lebih baik saya menggunakan bahasa Indonesia dan nanti dibantu oleh Weni untuk bisa menerjemahkan. Claire, terima kasih sekali. Ini kajian yang sangat menarik. Sekaligus juga menurut saya sangat ironis ya, karena lembaga-lembaga internasional yang seharusnya mendukung menjadi promotor untuk penegakan hak asasi manusia, tetapi kemudian mereka terlibat di dalam pelanggaran hak asasi manusia itu sendiri melalui pembiayaan yang ditujukan bagi kontrol terhadap narkotika ini. Nah, saya ingin memberikan sedikit pandangan yang berbeda di dalam melihat pendanaan dari lembaga-lembaga donor itu ya. Saya selalu mengatakan bahwa tidak ada makan siang yang gratis. Saya mengutip kutipan yang sangat terkenal sekali dari salah seorang penerima Nobel kita. Mungkin bisa masuk ke slide berikutnya.
Can
Ya,
you move to the next slide?
kalau kita bicara kalau kita melihat pendanaan donor itu sebenarnya kan ada dua sisi sebenarnya. Jadi pendanaan dari donor itu di satu sisi bisa digunakan untuk melegitimasi status quo dari kebijakan-kebijakan yang sudah ada, atau di sisi yang lain dia juga bisa dilihat sebagai sebuah alat advokasi ataupun dukungan bagi kita untuk melakukan perubahan. Nah, kalau kita melihat di dalam laporan yang tadi disampaikan oleh Claire, negara-negara penerima bantuan donor ini pada umumnya adalah negara-negara yang melegalkan hukuman mati. Nah, di satu sisi yang tadi, temuan ironisnya itu ada di sana bahwa bantuan yang berasal dari uang masyarakat yang menolak hukuman mati, tetapi kemudian digunakan untuk membiayai program-program yang mengontrol peredaran narkotika, tetapi ujung-ujungnya kemudian menjadi alat legitimasi untuk melakukan eksekusi mati bagi pelaku-pelaku narkoba ini. Dan itu juga saya lihat juga sebenarnya terjadi di Indonesia ya. Boleh ke next slide? Nah, kalau kita lihat, kalau saya boleh menceritakan sedikit dalam konteks Indonesia, narkotika, kejahatan narkotika itu selalu dan mungkin di seluruh negara juga sama, selalu dianggap sebagai sebuah kejahatan yang extraordinary katanya. Dan kemudian dia memberikan impact yang sangat luas terhadap publik, kesehatan publik, stabilitas, bahkan keamanan internasional, keamanan nasional dan internasional. Dan kemudian dikatakan juga bahwa kejahatan narkotika adalah kejahatan yang terorganisir. Dan kemudian katanya bahwa hukuman mati itu adalah satu bentuk hukuman yang ditujukan untuk membuat jerat terhadap pelaku-pelakunya. Tetapi kemudian ada saya mengutip satu kajian yang dilakukan di Indonesia yang dilakukan oleh Muhammad Hafiz dan Riza, yang ternyata menunjukkan bahwa hukuman mati yang terjadi di Indonesia itu sama sekali tidak memberikan efek yang signifikan terhadap peredaran narkotika. Ditambah lagi kemudian bahwa dalam konteks Indonesia saya ceritakan bahwa kemudian yang terjerat di dalam pasal-pasal pidana narkotika ini kebanyakan adalah orang-orang yang kemudian berasal dari kelompok-kelompok yang rentan, masyarakat miskin, tidak memiliki dukungan, dan mereka bahkan terlibat di dalam jaringan perdagangan orang. Jadi mereka yang kemudian terkena pasal-pasal hukuman mati di dalam undang-undang pidana yang ada di Indonesia adalah orang-orang yang kemudian memang dikorbankan. Nah, oleh satu organisasi yang terorganisir tadi. Nah, ini menarik sebenarnya untuk kita juga melihat dari sudut pandang ini. Jadi ketika bantuan-bantuan internasional yang ditujukan untuk pendanaan kontrol terhadap narkotika ini kemudian dipakai oleh negara-negara yang mendapat bantuan ini untuk melegitimasi sebenarnya kebijakan-kebijakan yang sudah kebijakan-kebijakan hukuman mati yang mereka miliki. Nah, tapi di satu sisi yang lain, ini sudut pandang yang saya pengen coba tawarkan kepada teman-teman adalah bagi kita organisasi masyarakat sipil dan juga pegiat-pegiat anti hukuman mati, sebenarnya pendanaan dari lembaga-lembaga donor ini bisa kita dorong untuk kemudian dipakai sebagai alat mempengaruhi kebijakan hukuman mati yang ada di negara-negara tersebut. Artinya kalau kita kemudian bisa memaksa lembaga-lembaga donor tadi atau mempengaruhi lembaga-lembaga donor tadi untuk konsisten dengan penegakan hak asasi manusia dan anti hukuman mati, maka kemudian bahwa kontrol narkotika ini pendanaan untuk kontrol narkotika ini bisa dipakai untuk mendorong lahirnya kebijakan-kebijakan anti hukuman mati di negara-negara yang tadi di riset. Nah, berikutnya satu lagi saya ingin perlihatkan kepada teman-teman. Next slide. Ya, di Indonesia itu lembaga negara yang menangani isu-isu narkotika itu kalau kami menyebutnya sebagai Badan Narkotika Nasional. Nah, di dalam APBN sendiri itu setiap tahun lembaga ini mendapatkan support yang sangat besar dari anggaran APBN negara Indonesia. Di sini saya munculkan misalnya pada tahun 2024 itu di dalam rupiah ya masih 1,51 triliun, kemudian 2025 3,21 triliun dan kemudian 2026 itu sekitar 1,3 65 triliun. Dan ini masih ada kemungkinan untuk ditambah karena saya lihat di dalam perdebatan di legislatif Badan Narkotika Nasional meminta agar pemerintah menambahkan alokasi anggarannya. Nah, tetapi ketika dilihat secara lebih rinci, anggaran ini lari kemana? Anggaran ini lari kemudian pada upaya represi dan penegakan hukumnya. Artinya adalah ini anggaran yang digunakan untuk melakukan pengejaran, melakukan kemudian tindakan-tindakan yang bertujuan untuk menangkap pelaku-pelaku peredaran narkotika ini. Nah, dan ujung-ujungnya kemudian pasti pada hukum pidana yang hukuman maksimalnya itu adalah hukuman mati memang. Nah, ketika sementara dari internasional sendiri, oke. Tadi sudah dikutip bahwa ada anggaran yang sangat besar sekali untuk Indonesia dari berbagai lembaga donor ini. Nah, menurut saya disinilah kemudian sebenarnya kalau untuk konteks Indonesia, apa yang paling menarik dan mengapa ini kemudian penting untuk didiskusikan di Indonesia, bantuan pendanaan dari donor-donor ini bisa kita jadikan sebagai alat untuk mendorong atau mengkonter kebijakan-kebijakan hukuman mati dengan memaksa lembaga donor dan pemerintah untuk melakukan perubahan-perubahan kebijakan ini. Begitu Mbak Ajeng, silakan.
Thank you so much. Terima kasih Mbak Yanti dan mohon maaf sekali waktunya agak
Tidak
terbatas.
apa-apa.
Thanks all for highlighting the different dimensions and point of view of why these findings matter. I think it's clear there's a shared sense of urgency, especially in the situation where drug executions are rising at the same time resources are getting more and more limited. Let's move to our second question. And the question is, how do you think this report could further support your work? Maybe for this one, we can start with Jada, followed by Mbayanti, and then Mai. Over to you.
Sure, thank you, Ajay. I think it helps our work in at least 3 ways. So I guess first of all, it gives us a basis for additional research and analysis. It paints a picture. It's a very grim picture, but it still doesn't tell us the whole story. And this is not because a lot of work went into it, but simply because there's too much that we simply don't know or wasn't shared with the authors, particularly again in terms of the due diligence policies and what was on paper supposed to happen and what was actually carried out, how civil society and involved actors, affected communities, for example, were engaged in any due diligence, and how the death penalty is integrated in considerations about funding and technical assistance when it comes to drug control. So first of all, it gives us a sense of the work that needs to happen by us and by other colleagues in the death penalty and drug policy reform movement who are interested in pursuing this line of work. Secondly, it allows us to identify new targets for advocacy and new actors who can or should play a stronger role in promoting death penalty abolition and drug policy reform, and to engage with them with this strong basis of evidence. As we know, drug-related executions are concentrated in a small cluster of hardcore retentionist countries. Iran is one of them, but is not the only one, and are all characterized by limited space for civil society engagement at domestic level. And this creates challenges. It sort of limits opportunities for advocacy and reform again domestically. What these findings do is that they allow us to look farther, so not only to governments that sentence people to death and execute them, but also to other actors who may have unwillingly or willingly supported this machinery that eventually leads to executions, either directly as donors or indirectly as members of governing and monitoring bodies. And I'm thinking, for example, about not only donor countries, but also member states of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which oversees reinforces the work of UNODC or member states of the DAC committee that Claire was talking about. And in this chain, we find abolitionist countries, countries who don't have or don't really use the death penalty as a tool of drug control, and even international institutions which have a clear abolitionist or do no harm positions. Again, UN policies are very clear that support to drug law enforcement should be paused if there's a real risk of human rights violations. And yet we see that these funds continue to flow, support continues to come with little scrutiny. And so these findings give us an opportunity to critically assess the role of those intermediaries, these monitors, and nudge them to implement their own policies or to reassess their work. And finally, I'll be brief, but I think it also reinforces messaging by HRI and other colleagues in the space that really is now the time to divest from ineffective and punitive policies and into health and social services that save lives, into community-led organizations that are at the forefront of advocacy and service delivery, and as Bakenti was saying just now, into civil society organizations who do this essential work of monitoring government actions and holding them to account. Again, I want to highlight these findings are again concerning, but they just show the tip of the iceberg of a hugely ineffective system. They only focus on international aid, not on other forms of international financing. They only look at projects coded as narcotics control, and they only look at retentionist countries for drug offenses. And so they give us the most extreme example of a massive structural misinvestment. And I just want to go back to a previous report published by HRI, which found almost $1 billion was spent in the past decade on narcotics control in so-called developing countries with very questionable sort of impacts. And this is, again, the most concerning potential example of those funds. This was unacceptable before, but again, it's even less acceptable now that we're facing such drastic cuts to international support for harm reduction, the HIV response, and health services. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Jada. Right on time. Bayanti, do you wanna go next and share your answer or your thoughts?
Oke, terima kasih Mbak Ajeng. Saya melihat laporan yang disampaikan oleh HRI ini rekomendasinya sangat multi aktor ya, dan ini sebenarnya sangat membantu kita, terutama kami di negara-negara penerima bantuan ini, untuk kemudian juga mulai berpikir ulang sebenarnya di dalam menggunakan laporan ini sebagai data dasar ataupun advocacy based on research ya di Indonesia. Terlebih saat ini di Indonesia sebenarnya sedang ada ruang yang sedang dibicarakan untuk merevisi undang-undang narkotika di Indonesia. Nah, menurut saya ini juga menjadi satu catatan yang bisa dipakai oleh teman-teman di Indonesia. Tapi seperti yang saya sampaikan satu hal tadi bahwa pembiayaan yang berasal dari donor ini itu bagaimanapun juga pendanaan ini berasal dari masyarakat di negara-negara yang memberikan bantuan pembiayaan itu ya, seperti Jepang, Amerika, itu kan dari pajak-pajak masyarakat di negara-negara sana ya. Dan salah satu selain menekan jadi sebenarnya kan ada konsep supply and demand ya di dalam hubungan ini. Jadi memang yang paling selain memperkuat gerakan advokasi yang ada di negara-negara penerima, menurut saya adalah menggerakkan kembali kepedulian ataupun komitmen dari masyarakat di negara-negara pemberi donor itu untuk kemudian bisa memperkuat komitmen mereka terhadap penegakan hak asasi manusia ini. Begitu Mbak Ajeng.
Baik, terima kasih Mbak Yanti. Mai, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ajahn. So the question is, how do you think this report could further support your work? So by my work. I'll speak a little bit about with my UN Special Rapporteur hat on as a member of Crime Info. So with the UNSR hat on, my work is mainly about monitoring, reporting, raising awareness, advocacy engagement. That's primarily my role as rapporteur. But I engage with, reports. I do 2 reports a year, one to the Human Rights Council, one to the General Assembly. And this topic, drug policy and human rights, it's something that I've been wanting to do a thematic report on. And in fact, I had 2 public calls for input, but I had to withdraw them both because of the geopolitical situation. But the publication of this report will definitely, when the right moment comes, to be able to do a more deep dive into the human rights situation, drug policy in Iran, will definitely be quoting from it and to be able to speak, on from the findings of this report and hopefully engaging side events as well as media as well. So that's something I could definitely use in terms of a concrete action point. And then I also, as part of my SR role, engage in bilateral meetings with states. So I would be, of course, with my mandate, I engage with the Iranian Permanent Mission in Geneva on a regular basis. And based on this report, I think I should have more engagement on this topic with the Permanent Mission in Japan, Permanent Mission of Japan in Geneva, as well as I think Permanent Mission of Germany. I think the report very much focuses on, because of the amount, Japan's sort of funding to Iran. But when I saw the one of the creative tables graphs, I think there was a thin line from Germany to Iran going there as well. And just want to flag the example of the 2017 drug law reform in Iran. My understanding is that that drug reform, of course, it was, done domestically, but there were some external pressures from European states expressing their dissatisfaction through UNODC that some of the funding was going to narcotics control in Iran. And I think that very much had a sort of a nudge in the right direction. And I think the same situation may be created here based on the findings of the report, and to encourage states who are involved in funding narcotics programs in Iran that the funding could be used for other drug policies such as harm reduction, which Iran already is pretty progressive in this area in the region with methadone programs and needle exchange. So those are the things I could do with the report with the SR hat on. Moving on with my hat with a member of Crime Info. And I'm conscious of the fact that my colleague is also listening into this event. I think steps for Crime Info and perhaps other NGOs in Japan could take is to learn a little bit more about, what other funding may be going from Japan. I think Claire made a good point, and it's iterated in the report, that what they found is only tip of the iceberg. What are the ways in which other funding could be located? Is it through freedom of information requests? What kind of searches can be done? So I think that will be the next step. But I think another point is, the evidence is already there. It might not be a complete picture of how much money goes out from Japan to other states that execute drug-related offenders, but the evidence is there that the money has been spent. So then another sort of the campaign and advocacy side is how to make it politically costly for Japan in terms of reputational damage to be known to be complicit in executions abroad. And I can think of, there may be different ways of campaigning and advocacy towards the policymakers. Perhaps individual parliamentarians may take an interest. I think there could be effective advocacy to Ministry of Justice, but also to the Foreign Ministry as well. And then there may be campaigns in terms of raising public awareness. And I'm not quite sure how much this would be an effective avenue. The reason I say this is Japan doesn't execute drug-related offenders, but Japan is a retentionist state and also has a pretty punitive drug policy. Cannabis use possession can end up with a pretty hefty prison incarceration. So I'm not sure. So I think there needs to be creative in how this finding is communicated. I don't have any clever ideas of yet, but I just wanted to sort of mention Japan as an executing state, although not for drug-related executions, but also with its own pretty punitive drug policy scheme.
Thank you so much. It's really encouraging to hear how research such as this can encourage further research, strengthen advocacy and policy engagement, and also efforts to promote greater responsibility and accountability, both on the side of the donor, but also on the side of the aid recipient country. Our final question for the panel is, based on the report's finding, what would your main recommendation be and to whom? You can draw it from the report's recommendation, or you can also share your own perspectives and recommendations. Mbak Yanti, do you mind starting first, and then we go to Mai
Ya,
and then Gina? Thank you.
ya. Terima kasih Mbak Ajeng. Eh, Terkait dengan apa rekomendasi saya terhadap eh, laporan ini dan mungkin juga rekomendasi yang tindakan yang bisa kita seperti yang tadi saya sudah sampaikan bahwa eh, bahwa ketika kita bicara soal eh, eh, menolak hukuman mati itu sudah menjadi hal mutlak yang harus kita perjuangkan ya. Tetapi ketika kita bicara tentang bagaimana pendanaan eh, dari lembaga-lembaga internasional ini terhadap eh, apa eh, eh, kontrol narkotika, tetapi di balik itu ternyata ada satu eh, dampak tersembunyi yang mengkhawatirkan, seperti yang tadi sudah kita bicarakan bahwa ini kemudian menjadi alat untuk melegitimasi kebijakan-kebijakan hukuman mati di negara-negara penerima bantuan. Nah, saya sekali lagi melihat ini kita tidak bisa mendorong perubahan ini hanya dari satu sisi. Jadi setiap aktor yang tadi diidentifikasi di dalam laporan, menurut saya memang harus secara bersama-sama untuk kemudian memikirkan dan melakukan tindakan-tindakan yang lebih nyata untuk melihat hubungan antara pemberian bantuan dana ini dengan tindakan yang melanggar hak asasi manusia pada hukuman mati begitu. Nah, dan di satu sisi lain pembiayaan ini seharusnya bisa lebih dipilah memang oleh lembaga-lembaga donor. Artinya ada kriteria-kriteria ataupun prasyarat-prasyarat yang ketat yang harus diterapkan kepada negara-negara ini. Satu, yang kedua itu adalah daripada kemudian sumber dana-dana yang diberikan ini menjadi alat legitimasi bagi hukuman mati, memang kalau saya lebih mendorong bahwa bantuan-bantuan ini diperbesar untuk program-program yang memang ditujukan untuk memperkuat kapasitas kelompok rentan, untuk kampanye, membuka kesadaran publik akan bahaya narkotika, ataupun untuk program-program yang bertujuan untuk memberikan akses yang pelayanan dasar manusia. Jadi sebagai terakhir saya, sekali lagi saya sampaikan bahwa memang betul saya tidak tahu apa agenda yang ada di balik yang difikirkan oleh negara-negara pemberi bantuan ataupun donor-donor yang memberikan bantuan kepada negara-negara berkembang ini, karena saya percaya sekali lagi bahwa tidak pernah ada makan siang yang gratis itu. Jadi saya masih memikirkan sebenarnya apa yang menjadi agenda tersembunyi yang difikirkan oleh lembaga-lembaga pemberi dana ataupun oleh negara-negara pemberi dana. Eh, Kalau memang ada agenda-agenda yang baik yang tersembunyi di balik pemberian bantuan ini, maka memang eh, apa sebaiknya memang harus dibuka kepada publik, transparansi dan akuntabilitasnya juga menjadi jelas, tidak hanya di lembaga-lembaga donornya, tetapi oleh negara-negara penerima bantuan. Terus terang sampai saat ini di Indonesia pun sangat sulit bagi kami untuk bisa mengakses laporan-laporan pendanaan-pendanaan dari program-program yang didanai dari lembaga donor ataupun dari APBN Indonesia sendiri. Itu Mbak Ajeng.
Terima kasih, Mbak Yanti. Might you want to answer next, please?
Sorry, Jen, I couldn't hear the last bit. Is it my turn or?
Yes, yes,
Yes,
please.
okay, perfect. Sorry. Yes, so the recommendations, I think I've already touched on sort of Japanese CSOs about, building on this reporting, collecting more information, getting a more complete picture of how the funding flows and targeting of sort of policymakers or MOJ, foreign ministry. But adding to that, it might be because of the Japanese pretty punitive, drug policy and attitude, it might be good that, for anti-death penalty NGOs in Japan and the sort of the drug NGOs to work together because Japan doesn't execute for drug-related offenders. I think those two types of CSOs I don't think have sort of collaborated, and this may be a good way for collaboration in coming up with, advocacy avenues. I think also in terms of CSOs, so Iran human rights CSOs, traditionally, I think when talking about executions, a lot of focus has been on political execution of political prisoners. And I think there's been a sort of a gradual change over the years for some of these CSOs to focus more on drug-related executions and picking up individual cases. So I think it's a good change, but I think, other Iran human rights NGOs could also do more on drug-related executions as well. In terms of Iranian authorities, I mentioned earlier that there is a sort of a further amendment to the narcotics law. I think it's important that that is encouraged for further reform. I would also sort of I haven't seen the detail of the new amendment, but based on some of the reportings in domestic media, I think there's perhaps a further increase in the capital threshold. But I don't think there's any mitigating or aggravating circumstance. There is no discretion on the judges. And I think that's an area I think that probably could be explored. And then something on the UN. Since I started my mandate, I sort of try to refrain from describing the UN as one sort of entity or one block because the reality is that there are many mechanisms and agencies. But I think it is, and because of this system, I think it is important that different UN agencies mechanism speak with one voice. And I think UNODC is now vocal about, the drug-related executions are in violation of human rights standards. But I think more could be done about the mentioning of the number of executions in the World Drug Report and perhaps a closer alignment with OHCHR, Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, may be useful in having more of a united voice there. And then just finally on the states, I think it's also important to remember that it's basically states that make up and fund and mobilize various UN mechanisms. And I think, Giada, you talked about the different levels of complicity and participation in sort of the causal sort of link of the drug-related executions happening. And I think it's important that states are also mobilized and perhaps states that could come together. I was just thinking about a statement that was led by the Australian government back in 2021 on statement against the use of the death penalty for religious offenses, blasphemy, apostasy. Those like Japan and US retentionist states actually joined that statement. And I wonder whether something similar, it could also be done. I very much doubt US will join, but it's possible that Japan could join such a statement. And I'm not trying to say one statement changes, but I think it's about building a momentum and having this discussion at various UN fora. So I will end there on the recommendations.
Thank you, Mai. Thank you so much. Jeda,
Thanks,
over to you.
Ashley. I'll be brief, and I think I'll start exactly where my ended, because I think are also from HRI as an international organization, the main recommendations would probably be to international and multilateral actors, so the intermediaries which have been identified. I don't know if we said that already, but almost 2/3 of these money went through UN agencies and other multilateral institutions. The monitors, so particularly OECD and the member states who make up OECD and their governing bodies and entities, to engage constructively with these findings and start asking questions on the basis on those. The UN again plays a fundamental role, which we don't want to lose, both as a standard setting body and in implementing and supporting important interventions at domestic and regional level. It has clear policies in place on, again, human rights assessments and due diligence. And we also know that donor countries have significant decision-making power when it comes to where the money goes and to do what. However, it's critical that these resources, these limited resources, particularly those that flow through the UN, go where it's most needed, that rigorous safeguards are in place to avoid harm being done. And so the invitation would be to these institutions, first of all, to be more transparent about what is supported and how this is really easy to do, to be more open to civil society and affected communities, as well as other parts of the UN system. Mai, for example, was talking about OHCHR, to meaningfully engage with them in all aspects of their work, including monitoring, assessment, and evaluation of projects, and also to be bolder in integrating death penalty abolition, both in their public messaging and in their technical work. The Iran program, which was highlighted, for example, is due to end at the end of 2026. There will be an evaluation process, and I think it's a great opportunity to see how civil society and other affected groups can be integrated into that process. With regards to OECD specifically, again, the monitoring work that it does is really important. We don't want to lose the limited transparency that comes with projects being reported to OECD and added to OECD statistics. But the organization has a responsibility to issue much clearer guidance on what is acceptable spending when it comes to narcotics control, and how retention of the death penalty for drug offenses and a track record of human rights violations affects fundability of narcotics control projects. Again, OECD has in the past issued guidance for specific activities, particularly migration-related activities, which clarifies that assistance in this area must comply with human rights objectives. It has clarified some kind of activities which cannot be reported as ODA, and so it's time to do the same for narcotics control. And then on a more systemic level, I think a more systemic recommendation would be to question why narcotics control is even an acceptable category of ODA spending in 2026. I think Claire hinted at that during her presentation. This is money that's supposed to go to promote the economic welfare and development of so-called developing countries. This is not to say that no international aid should go to drug policy-related activities. There are other sector codes which are used to report projects which are used, for example, to enhance health and social services. We're also not saying that the citizens of the countries with problematic track records should not enjoy or benefit from international aid. There are beneficiary countries such as Iran, Malaysia, Indonesia, who has, for example, harm reduction and HIV projects in place, which should be supported through international aid. But this narcotics control category is a very specific one, and is one which we know is overwhelmingly used to support supply reduction, which has at best proven to be ineffective, at worst enable significant human rights violation, then stifle drug policy reform. And so we need to have this difficult conversation about why these limited funds go to support narcotics control projects. Maybe the last point on this doesn't need to be a political discussion. There is so much evidence now on the impacts of punitive drug policies on the communities that are impacted by drug markets. There's also authoritative guidance, and I want to mention the UNDP, the UN Development Program, recent guidance on development dimensions on drug policy, where it clearly states that punitive approaches to drugs have been ineffective or harmful to key areas of development, such as human rights, but also public health, governance, environmental sustainability, and that governments should start looking into shifting their approach to drugs and the drug market and consider, again, different policies such as regulation. And I'm really curious whether OECD took those recommendations on point. Otherwise, I think it's a good time to start having those discussions based on this wealth of evidence that we now have. I'll stop here, but I think we're happy to answer any question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all panelists for the thoughtful reflections and also the recommendations. We now have some time for questions from the audience. I think there is a question on specifically for Mai on on Japan pacifist constitution. There is also a question around the if the resources were invested differently, what impact could they have in your area of work, which I would invite all panelists and speakers to answer to this. Maya, I wonder if you want to start with your answers.
Okay, so I'm just opening the question. So I think the question reads, can Japan's pacifist constitution that renounces war be used to denounce its support for the war on drugs? Yeah, interesting question. Thank you for this. Short answer is no, because in a legal sense, because Japan's Article 9 of the Constitution is about the war in its sort of the legal sense of the word. And I believe war on drugs, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it started from, is it President Nixon in the 1970 announcing drug abuse as public enemy number one, and I don't know whether he is the one who used the actual term war on drugs, but so in terms of legal sense, no, but as a campaign tool, more of a rhetorical point, I guess you could link the Japan's sort of, pacifist sort of stance on that to it. I'm not sure whether, a campaign that hinges on that will be effective or not, but an interesting point.
Thanks so much, Mai. I'll invite other speakers to answer the question around and what impact could we have if we invest the 60 million US dollars differently. I think Kat has also replied, but yeah, if other speakers wants to answer to that, please feel free.
Ya, mungkin saya Mbak Ajeng.
Yes, silakan Mbak Yanti.
Ya, 60 miliar USD itu kalau diperbandingkan dengan anggaran pendidikan dasar dan pendidikan menengah di Indonesia itu sama dengan 2 kali anggaran pendidikan menengah dan pendidikan dasar di Indonesia. Jadi kita bisa bayangkan dengan 60 miliar dolar Amerika itu, maka kalau itu dialokasikan untuk membantu pendidikan anak-anak di Indonesia untuk pendidikan dasar dan pendidikan menengahnya, maka dia akan mampu mengurangi secara signifikan jumlah anak yang putus sekolah, kemudian memperbaiki gaji-gaji guru yang sangat kecil sekali di Indonesia, dan kemudian memperbaiki banyak sekolah sebenarnya. Jadi sangat 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 disayangkan memang pada tahun ini anggaran pendidikan di Indonesia banyak sekali dipotong untuk program makan bergizi gratis yang tidak tepat sasaran kalau menurut analisis dari kami para peneliti di Indonesia. Dan kalau dana untuk narkotika ini diberikan untuk pendidikan dasar dan menengah, ini akan memberikan dampak yang luar biasa sekali terhadap masa depan anak-anak di Indonesia. Jadi itu saya membayangkannya seperti itu. Eh, jadi eh, ini angka yang mungkin bagi sebagian negara-negara dianggap kecil mungkin, tetapi bagi Indonesia angka ini sebenarnya sangat besar sekali karena ternyata dia 2 kali dari anggaran pendidikan dasar dan menengah kami. Belum lagi bila diperbandingkan dengan apa eh, program-program lain yang dibutuhkannya misalnya untuk apa kesehatan ibu dan anak ataupun kemudian untuk memperbaiki berbagai infrastruktur eh, tidak untuk membeli senjata bagi aparat yang menangkap eh, orang-orang miskin untuk dengan alasan sebagai pengedar narkoba ya, narkotika. Jadi menurut saya ini hal yang sangat eh, sebenarnya saya merasa sangat sedih sekaligus juga merasa
Deg-degan ya,
sangat
Mbak.
betul karena ini anggaran yang dikumpulkan dari seluruh
Baik,
masyarakat di dunia, dari negara-negara, dari pajak-pajak masyarakat di dunia, dan
baik,
ternyata dihabiskan dengan cara yang sebenarnya menurut kita tidak tepat dan itu sangat disayangkan sekali. Terlebih
baik,
transparansi dan akuntabilitasnya juga tidak pernah kita ketahui. Jadi itu aja sebagai penutup
baik.
dari jawaban ini.
Baik, terima kasih Mbak Yenti. I would like to ask if Jada or Claire, you want to answer the remaining questions, please.
I can maybe start, but then I'm keen for Claire to come in as well. I think both Kat and Ruth already shared some figures and some thoughts about the difference that this kind of money would make to the harm reduction response. Just to mention briefly, we have evidence about harm reduction also being very cost effective. It's not expensive at all. I think the estimate was for a needle and syringe program to cost like $70 a year per person, and an OAT program to cost around 8,000 and something dollars a year per person. And so you can make the calculations about what such a figure could cover. And not only the fact that it's cheap, but also the sort of positive impact that it has versus very expensive interventions which don't really yield a lot of positive results. With regards to the question on Vietnam and whether any money should be spent, I think I hinted at it already, but maybe to reiterate, it's true, Vietnam, first of all, Vietnam amended their laws to reduce the number of drug crimes which are death eligible, but it still has the death penalty for drug offenses, for some drug trafficking crimes, and is, we believe, a lead executioner for drugs, though we can't really know what goes on inside the country because of lack of transparency. And then the short answer is no. I think, at least on a maybe more of a personal opinion, I do not believe any official development assistance money should go to the war on drugs. The war on drugs has never been short of funding, so even if we take ODA out, we're sure that there's going to be enough resources in other pots to support supply reduction. But again, this is a very limited pot of money. It's official money, as Bakianti was saying, it comes from public funds and is supposed to go to support the welfare and development of people. And we know narcotics control just doesn't do that. Thank you.
Can I add something here now?
Please.
So I was thinking, thank you for these questions. I thought they made me think both the question about how this money could have been used otherwise, and the question about, if the death penalty is no longer applicable, is it still a problem? It really made me think of and also another IJ Institute for Journalism and Social Change, Follow the Money project, which we published a couple of years ago, and it was tracing international aid funding, so some similar resources from aid donors going to anti-LGBT groups in Uganda that were supporting the death penalty for homosexuality in Uganda in a new bill that was then passed. And the money that we focused on there is similar to this case. It was money that could have been spent otherwise on human rights instead of the attack on human rights. It was also, similarly coming from institutions and donors that are supposed to be part of international human rights and abiding by and supporting and promoting international human rights. So it was contradictory funding flows, money that could have been spent on rights instead. It was also money that we thought was spent on harm. And so like if this money had been spent differently, or if this money starts to be spent differently, and this is the point about doing two good things with $1. When you take money away from something that is doing harm and put money into something that supports harm reduction instead, in this example, you're doing two really significant things. So the question is not just how much harm reduction services could be bought with $60 million, for example. It's also, what is the harm that was done with that $60 million? And like, what do we do about that harm? And so this is also why I had mentioned in my presentation, I think that any donor or institution that has been involved in these flows, at any point, even if they were to stop, they need to look at the harm that was produced and what reparative measures should be taken, can be taken in response to that. Also, so we did this follow the money research on Uganda that had the death penalty context as well. But we've also followed aid funding to anti-abortion and anti-LGBT actors in contexts that don't have the death penalty. And so I think very similarly in this case, all of the harmful money is a problem. When the death penalty is part of the equation and executions are actually happening, the stakes are just so much higher. And I think it's right that those cases get particular attention and immediacy and calls for urgent action. But all harmful funding, I think, should and has to be challenged.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all the speakers and panelists. Unfortunately, we are short on time. And I guess to formally conclude today's event, it is now my pleasure to invite Catherine Cook, the Executive Director at Harm Reduction International, to deliver the closing remarks. Kat, over to you.
Thanks, Ajeng, and thank you to all our speakers and participants today. Particular thanks to Claire and IGSC for this continued collaboration in this area of work. We've heard from wonderful panelists today that the death penalty abolition and drug policy reform movements are deeply entrenched and interdependent. And we've heard that aid funding is being used in retentionist countries for narcotics control activities. And at the same time, in many countries, we've got chronic underfunding, which has been followed by drastic funding cuts since 2025 and has left harm reduction on its knees. So it's really obscene that at the same time, aid funds are being channeled into narcotics control assistance in any states, but in particular, this case is absolutely tragic and requires urgent action where we've got the death penalty being used for drug offences. And it must be challenged, it must be addressed, and this funding must be redirected to expand access to programs that strengthen communities and save lives. So I just want to finish by echoing some of the key messages that we've heard today. There is absolutely no place for narcotics control within aid budgets. Donors should divest from punitive drug approaches and invest in community health and justice, including harm reduction and advocacy for death penalty abolition. Donors must be more transparent about their spending. We must all hold them to account. As Claire said, if your government is spending aid funds on narcotics control, you're affected. It's your taxpayer money. And if your country is receiving funding through this sector code, you're affected. Donors and intermediary institutions such as UNODC must work harder to ensure that funding and technical assistance does not risk contributing to the imposition of death sentences and other human rights violations. And we've heard that we're in this perfect storm moment, but this is also an opportunity for advocating for change and really, highlighting these tensions. This year, we have a potentially historic review of the international drug control regime happening. And this report sheds further light on the infrastructure behind drug law enforcement and the unintended consequences of a system which prioritizes punishment and repression over rights and health. This report exposes the tensions between different parts of the international ecosystem and points to urgent reforms required to ensure that aid funding and the drug control architecture protect the health and welfare of all. And just to finish, I'm excited that we've got people outside the drug policy and harm reduction movement in this room today, in this virtual space. And I really hope that we can work together, as harm reduction advocates, death penalty abolitionists, aid accountability advocates, to really make change and hold these actors to account and put this situation right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Kat, for those closing remarks. Today's discussion has underscored not only the importance of the report's findings, but also the urgent need to ensure that international assistance actually advances health, development, and human rights, rather than contributing directly or indirectly to harmful and punitive responses. Thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your expertise and insight today. And I'd like to also extend our sincere thanks to everyone who joined us from around the world, as well as to our interpreters and the team working behind the scenes to make today's event possible. Thank you once again, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye, everyone.
Ajeng. Thank you, Yenti, for your amazing contribution to the webinar.
Thanks.
Ya, thank you, Kat.
Everyone.
Nice to
Bye.
meet you here. Mbak
Thank
Ajeng,
you.
terima kasih.
Sama-sama. Terima kasih banyak semua.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all.
Okay, bye.
Bye.